I mean, the question is, why do we have healthcare systems anyway? Why don't we leave it up to the people to care for their health?
Hi, I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Clarinda.
And this is Not Just Patients,
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Our guest today is Dr. Anke-Peggy Holtorf, who will be helping us demystify regulatory affairs and HTA.
Anke's areas of expertise include the value of healthcare products and policy decisions related to health technologies, health technology assessment processes, outcomes research, and health economics. With global experience, including in low and middle income countries, she has published broadly on various subjects such as evidence-based decision-making, policies in healthcare, and the methods for including the patient perspective. At Health Technology Assessment International, she acts as secretary of the board and is a steering committee member and project coordinator for the Patient and Citizen Involvement in HTA Interest Group, where she has co-led several projects. She is co-editor of the second edition of the book on patient involvement in HTA, which will be published in 2025. In addition, as a guest lecturer and adjunct faculty at the University of Utah, Anke has taught graduate courses in international health policy, including HTA and the role of patient involvement. Anke, it's a real pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Before we jump in, I would like to set the context for our listeners. So by and large, I think that a lot of people know that medicines go through clinical trials, but they don't necessarily know what happens between the clinical trial and the time that they get the medicine in their hand. So that's where these processes come in, and maybe we can just start with you helping us define regulatory affairs and HTA and positioning them on the entire timeline of medicine development.
Yes, I'll try to do that. As you just pointed out, medicines are developed in a quite structured way usually, and then at some point they're ready for the market. And here is where regulatory processes set in, because we only want the products which are good for us in a way. And so the first question which is asked by the regulatory authorities is, does this product do more good than harm for patients? So basically, they look at all the information they have, which is information which comes from the clinical trials. And based on the information from these studies, they will assess the clinical benefits that come from these products and the potential safety issues which can be expected. After evaluating that, if they say, okay, this product definitely does more good than harm, then they give the market authorization, which means that a product can come to the market. But there is an additional hurdle they have to overcome to get reimbursement, because if they don't get reimbursement from whatever system the country has, people would have to pay out of pocket for it. And that is not very attractive. So the health technology developer has to submit a package for health technology assessment. And this is where the question is asked, does this intervention offer useful, appropriate, and affordable benefits for patients? So it's a slightly different question. And the evidence that is taken here is on one side as well, coming from the clinical trials. But here the assessment is much more comparative. That means, what is the current standard of care? And compared to the current standard of care, what do we get?
Right.
So health technology assessment bodies usually only do the assessment. They may give recommendations at the end, but they don't make decisions.
Right.
But then there's also, if patients do get access in the end, I assume there's ongoing reviews to check that it's safe once it's in larger populations, once it's in the real world, to check it's continuing to be effective and cost effective.
So again, there's the regulatory side. The continuous activity there is really more focused on the harms, is the collection of side effects, the monitoring, and taking action if there's something coming up which is more severe than expected. That may then lead to a blockage of selling that product further. The health technology assessment, how that continues, is a bit different.
Okay.
And it depends really on country to country, but there is some continuity. And ideally, they should, like every 3 years, go back. Does it deliver the value we were expecting? If not, are we still willing to pay for it? Do we have to renegotiate? And so on and so on. And at some point at the end of the life cycle, when there are new products which have come to the markets, then there may also be an assessment to decide whether to disinvest.
Yeah. Do the regulatory authorities and the HTA bodies talk to each other?
It depends. So the regulatory bodies are usually on the national level or multi-country level. Like in the European Union, it's done on a central level, the European Medicines Agency. However, there are about 50 regulatory organizations, competent authorities, which are based in the countries and have different purposes, and they collaborate among each other. For HTA, it's a bit different. HTA is usually on a national level or on a subnational level, like in Italy and in Spain, you have regional bodies with different definitions. Or sometimes it's in an organization, like maybe in a health provider organization or a health systems organization in the US or in Europe. In hospitals, for example, they may have their own HTA unit. And so it's not all HTA people talk all the time to the regulatory people, but on certain levels where their interests overlap, they may collaborate from time to time, but they have separate tasks.
Yeah, got it.
So thank you for that wide overview. I think what would be great now is if we could zoom into each of those steps a little bit. So firstly, with regards to regulatory affairs, could you give us a bit of an overview of what that process looks like and what criteria would be needed for a product to be successful?
Perhaps I take a step back to this point of medicines development. So we have this health technology developer. I guess we focus here on medicines more than medical devices or diagnostics. And the clinical development happens in phases, which most people have heard of, phase 1, 2, 3, which is basically an incremental testing of this compound in the target indications. And the way this is structured is that at the end of the development, all data are there which can be submitted to the regulatory authorities. So once these data come to the authorities, the development is completed. They cannot change anything more. They have the data they have. So they try often already earlier to interact with the regulatory authorities to get input. Do we collect the right data? Is this the right clinical trials we are doing? Is this the right endpoints we are using to maximize their success rate? So now they have this dossier. And you see that I'm already a bit gray, so I've been long in the business. When I was younger, they would really have trucks of files, which would be brought to the regulatory authorities, where they had like all the data, all the clinical trial stuff, which they had to go through. Nowadays, that's electronic, but it's still a lot of information, which is submitted as a big file to the regulatory authority. There's very clear guidance on what data have to be submitted. And then there begins this review process. And I guess the success criteria is good data, and does it do more good than harm for patients? The good for the regulatory authorities is assessed by looking at efficacy, which is, in a positive sense, the endpoints which were in the clinical trials and how much of an effect can be seen there. And the other side, the harm, that's basically the adverse events or side effects. It's definitely unintended. But when I studied pharmacology in university, my professor always said there is no effect without a side effect. And it's only the question here is how big is the side effect and how acceptable is it?
Right.
Now, the issue is that at the point when this is assessed originally, we only have the data from the clinical trials. So that is patient populations from a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, but it's still a limited size population. Let's say altogether we had 10,000 people in the clinical trials, and there is a side effect which only happens like for one person in 100,000, then there is a high chance that they never saw this side effect in the clinical trials. So that is the caveat. And therefore, the regular authorities basically continue working after giving the market authorization by asking to monitor these side effects in the use while the product is on the market.
Nice. That's very helpful. So who then are all the players involved at this stage? Apart from the regulatory authorities, is there a constant back and forth, say, with the pharma company? Are patients involved at this stage?
I mean, what does stakeholder mean? Stakeholder means anybody who has an interest in this.
Yeah.
So pharma companies have a big interest in it. And the regulatory agency, they can go back to the pharma company and say, we don't understand. Why did you do this? We don't understand this. So there are points where they can have interaction, or they can ask for additional evidence if they don't find what they need. Then in terms of involvement, they will definitely involve clinical people who have gained experience maybe during the clinical trial, or who can give other relevant input into this. And they may involve patients or patient representatives for different reasons during the process of regulatory assessment.
And the role of the patient then, just thinking about what you were saying about the sort of risk versus benefit, looking at a product leaflet for any medicine, quite often they have a really long list of scary looking side effects, for example. And I think that would put a lot of people off. But a patient who is living with the disease might often have a really different perspective on that, because they see the benefit as really outweighing the potential risk of an adverse event. So do patients have a role in that decision making about whether the benefit outweighs the risk?
Yes. It depends on the agency. So you have in the US, you have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. In Europe, you have the European Medicines Agency. In China, you have the Chinese FDA. So you have all these different regulatory organizations, and they all have different processes. The FDA and also the European Medicines Agency, they have defined processes on patient involvement. They have defined requirements on like how patients should be involved in the clinical trials. Specifically, the FDA really asked for, with all the documentation submitting on how patients have been involved or patients' insights have been used in clinical trials, to make sure that this is really relevant to the way patients experience their disease. And then in the processes, patients can be involved as being members of oversight committees. Patients can be involved by being asked specific questions about specific technologies, experiences they may have with those. Patients can be asked by giving input on reports. So the report is published, and then patients are consulted, basically. Read through this report. Do you see anything which doesn't make sense to you? So there's the different levels on how patients can be involved, and thereby they also shape the foundation for the decision.
You mentioned that the EMA and the FDA have processes kind of in place to involve the patient. How recent is this development, and how has it evolved over time?
It's not that recent. EMA, as far as I know, has already since a long time involved patients or other stakeholders in different ways. It's maybe in the last 20 years that it's become more structured and more defined in the guidance and the regulations. Traditionally, patients were not involved. And why has that changed? I think that has changed on one side in the 80s when the HIV crisis came up. And suddenly there were patients who were well educated, well spoken out. They insisted on having a right to their health. And that was really quite new at that time, because before there wasn't any channel to make that happen. And then in the 90s, the availability of the internet and the availability of so much information through the internet has led to a much higher level of literacy, of demand from the patient side, and therefore a higher ability to participate in these processes. I think things went a bit hand in hand there to allow for, let's say, a democratization of the processes.
Yeah. And I mean, I would think that all of this is quite technical, and especially the regulatory approval process. So what would the kind of qualifications a patient need to participate in this sort of process?
So basically, there is no qualification needed. Any patient has the qualification of having experiences with their own health, with their body, with the care they receive, with the relationships to the caregivers they have. And this is already a lot of experience which would be important in the decision-making process, basically. So that is one side. However, you can see it like a little bit like a career. Basically, you could be somebody who says, this is my life and I want to contribute my experiences to this process. But you could also say, actually, I want to be part of shaping the process. And then obviously you need to understand how the process works. And you need to understand how decisions are made and how the evidence is evaluated and so on and so on. So the more you want to influence the process itself, the more you should understand how these processes work. And sometimes these authorities, they would love to talk to people who don't have any deformation or so in terms of knowledge. So you don't know too much because they want to know the naive experience, basically.
Right.
But for other things, you do need to have some understanding of the system.
Right. So what I'm taking away is that for many patients, it might seem like a black box, this whole regulatory affairs process, and the idea that it only takes really highly qualified individuals in a very technical field to participate. But it's heartening to know that all they need to do is bring their lived experience, and in some cases, they can participate like that. But if they want to do more, there is also room for them to learn and upskill and then potentially contribute at that level.
Yes. I mean, we also have to remember that not all patients want to contribute to this. But for the ones who would like to contribute or who are asked to contribute, I think there is no reason to have fears and not to do it, because basically what you need is the experience as patients. That's what the actual expertise is.
Right. So then for patients who do want to get involved, how would they find out about these opportunities, and how might they begin to get involved in regulatory affairs?
Okay, there's a few things there. The most important is you need to understand how the system works where you live. So that would be the first step, is try to figure out what is the regulatory authority which is relevant to you. And then look on their website if they involve and how they involve patients, how that works, how you can alert them about your willingness to participate and so on. The other thing for participating in the regulatory processes is that they really want to have patient input. That comes from the patient. They don't want patient input that comes from others. So what they don't want is patients who are instructed by industry what to say when they come to authorities. And I think that is right. And we all want it this way because we want to make rational decisions on these things. And we want to have independent decisions and a high level of transparency in that. And therefore, if you collaborate with industry, that is great, but it may prevent you from collaborating with the regulatory or other authorities at the same time. If it's a patient organization, then for them it is also very important to know about this potential conflict of interest to balance in their activities and to ensure that they keep their independence. in a way that it still allows them to do the things they want to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, just because as a patient advocate, I suppose you almost want to get involved as much as you can, but there are, rightfully so, a few of these conflicts whereby you can't be seen to be biased towards a particular company if you're then reviewing, the regulatory process that they're going through from the other side. So I think it's a really good thing to inform more people about. And from a patient organisation perspective, of course, it's amazing if the patient organisation can work with the pharmaceutical industry or company to support with their trials and make sure that they're fit for purpose. But then you have to make sure it doesn't look too biased when you come to the regulatory stage of it. So it is quite a complex and maybe nuanced problem, I think, in the patient advocacy community.
I agree. It is, but I think it's also a matter of setting priorities for yourself. If you find an opportunity as a patient organization or a patient to engage with a company in a real sense, to partner, to co-create a product which just makes sense for patients, then I think this is a huge opportunity to do so. You will probably not be asked to come to the regulatory authority on the same product, but you have a huge opportunity to shape the development. But in other instances, if it's only about being invited to webinars and seminars and nice dinners or something, maybe you set your priorities somewhere else.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice. And I suppose it's nice in a way because even if you can't support by reviewing the regulatory dossier that they have submitted from the regulatory side, hopefully that dossier will be stronger if you've been involved earlier. So having patients and maybe even having different patients along the pathway to make sure that what's actually being done at each stage is robust is a good way to make sure that only the best products are getting approved and given to patients.
Yeah, one thing I would like to say is, as a patient, usually you are not reviewing the dossiers. And I mean, I'm not reviewing the dossiers. That's a scary thing to do. Quite happy to leave that to the people who know how to do it.
Yeah.
You are more shaping the questions they are asking. You're more shaping the interpretation. What does this evidence mean to us or so?
Yeah, that's less scary. Thank you.
So I think that we've laid it out that overall regulators are welcoming of patients and keen on having patients on board. What would you say are some of the barriers to patients actually getting involved? So one you mentioned, for example, is if there's a conflict of interest and a patient advocate is already working with an industry partner, for example.
A barrier could also be that the definitions of conflict of interest are so narrow that they prevent a lot of patients for different reasons to participate. Each of these organizations, they define what conflict of interest means to them. So usually, what should be standard in these processes is a declaration of interest so that everybody who participates, the researchers, the patients, the clinicians, that each of them has to declare their interest. I'm a member of a patient organization, this one. I'm paid by this company, and so on. And then it's up to either some committee or a standard process to define where is the level where we say this person has a conflict of interests when they work with us. You asked about barriers. I think the complexity of the processes is definitely a barrier for many people because they think like, what?
Yeah.
Read the documents? No, forget it. The other barriers, once they're in these committees, sometimes it's the existing or perceived hierarchies. Like, let's say there's a clinician sitting at the table, there's somebody from the regulatory agency, some industry person, and the patient. There is, even if it's not defined in the room, there is a certain hierarchy, which often puts patients off a little bit. Then a high barrier are wrong expectations. So what did I actually expect to achieve when I went into the process? And it's very clear that patients will not make the decision. They can give their input. And if I go into this as a patient and I say, like, I really want this technology, and then I'm disappointed if the technology doesn't come. That's not why I was involved. I was involved to help them to understand better what my needs are, what my expectations are, how much the technology perhaps meets that, and so on. And then what probably the biggest barrier is not even knowing about the opportunity, and even knowing about the opportunity, not knowing how to realize that.
And precisely why we wanted to talk to you today and release an episode on it, because we both work, professionally in the medicines development space in some aspect. And a surprising number of people I know aren't really fully aware of what these processes are. And I think, like we said before, it's quite daunting for patients who maybe don't really know what the processes are and how to get involved. So it's been really helpful having you talk about that. And I just wondered, following those barriers that you spoke about, are there initiatives that are being carried out to sort of help remove those barriers? I think just things like education, like the UParty patient training program, they obviously have a lot of resources to describe what regulatory affairs is and how to get involved. And hopefully, there are some regulatory authorities as well who are trying to make it more accessible to patients. But I wondered if you knew of any other initiatives that were looking to help patients get more involved.
Yeah, I think you will find these organizations, and you did mention UParty already. Often it's also the authorities themselves. If they have defined for themselves that they want to involve patients at certain steps in their processes or all the way through, they start realizing that it's not that easy. And then often they produce material for patients, for the information. Else is like, this is how we work. This is how you can become involved. This is the person you should call. And I think using those resources, which are usually posted on the websites, that's a helpful step. They also have, over the time, improved their processes for how they involve patients. So it's kind of learning exercise in a way. We started doing it. We saw it didn't work so well. Okay, let's try something else. What were the experiences? This is what this was. Now let's do it better next time. So I think it's kind of like developing together. A lot of information you find also with patient organizations who have done this already. So that sometimes can be a good source to understand what is needed, what was useful, what was not so useful, and so on.
Great. Thank you.
My only last question was, what percentage of medicines actually clear the regulatory affairs process and the success rate?
That's a good question. I think there is an up and down. When you think 20, 30 years back, the refusal rate was about 50%, both for the FDA and the EMA. But we've all learned, and now it's around 10 to 20%.
Sorry, and that's 10 to 20% fail.
Oh,
okay. So actually the majority make it.
So it means companies or technologies are much better prepared when they come to the process today. Maybe it's also a bit more transparent today.
Right.
That the chances of getting the market authorization are better.
Yeah, that's a great overarching context to have, because we are aware of the spends and the kind of timelines that drug development takes. And then you would hope that more and more drugs are clearing that process because of good evidence. So,
I mean, there is a few buts there. One is there's always a research question. And in the regulatory affairs, it is focused on the indications that were asked. Basically, you had clinical trials that asked certain questions. So you cannot get more market authorization than was proven in your clinical trial, basically.
Right.
So you have these labels, which are usually quite narrow, and then you can only use this in this narrow indication. And to get broader indication, you need to submit more evidence. Then maybe at a later stage, you get a broader indication. So that is one of the limitations of this.
So just to give an example of that, if the trials were only in people aged 16 and over, then the authorization they get would only be in people 16 and over, but later on, if they do more trials in children, they could expand that.
That would be one example. Yeah. And then the other big thing is the safety aspect. Regulatory authorities are extremely sensitive to safety problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that is good, but sometimes it does kill drugs.
Okay.
And that's basically also where patients could make a difference, where patients can say, I have such a miserable life. If I get this bit of improvement in my quality of life, I'm quite happy to accept this side effect.
Yeah. Thank you, Anke. That's really helpful. I certainly understand a bit more about regulatory affairs now. So just moving on then to the next step in the process. So once a drug has been approved as being, safe and effective by the regulatory authorities, it moves into a HTA process. Now, my first question that I just want to clarify, because I think it confuses people. So HTA stands for Health Technology Assessment. So what is a health technology?
A health technology is any intervention which is used to improve the life of a patient. It could be a medicine, it could be a medical device, it could be a diagnostic, it could be a vaccine, it could be an education program or procedure, like a combination of different interventions. So it's a very broad expression.
Perfect. I think the word technology sometimes confuses people.
Yeah.
Good. So now that's out the way. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the HTA process is?
Yeah. So let's perhaps first ask why HTA? We do have limited resources, right? The country we live in has a general budget, and of that general budget, there are 10 or 12 or 13% spent for healthcare. And now there's so many new technologies coming in. What do we do?
Yeah.
So we have to have some process which helps us to, within the limited resources we have, to make good decisions on which technologies to adopt and which ones not to adopt. I mean, we only want technologies that improve health and do not bankrupt our system.
Yeah. Right.
So what is health technology assessment? It's an explicit process. It's multidisciplinary and considers all the evidence that is there to understand the intended and unintended implications of the technology and the consequences in terms of health and in terms of cost.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned a country's budget, and I think that you were referring by and large to the European framework where it is the government that fund health, essentially. What about a system like the US where it is insurer-based? What are the differences between those two in that case?
Well, the biggest difference is that there is only limited use of HTA in the US, although this is really changing. But basically, if you look like how does healthcare works, you have two main models. One is the beverage model, which is, the example is the UK, where you have a tax-based system and all the healthcare is paid out of tax. And so you have basically a national healthcare system.
Right.
And the other system is the Bismarck model, which is the originally German model, where there is something like a solidarity principle in a social insurance. So everybody pays into this insurance and then who gets their services or the healthcare covered. Those are the main systems. Now, then you have totally private insurance-based systems, often in low income countries. And the US is basically a mix of all of that. Now, health technology assessment would be valid in both the Bismarck model and the Beveridge model. It could be done on a national level, it could be done on a regional level or on a population or like certain organizational level. Where it's usually not done is for people who pay out of pocket or for like totally private insurance.
So
often, for example, in South Africa, you have a lot of private insurance-based healthcare and you have a little bit of public. And the initiatives now to introduce HTA, they really try to get the private insurances on board. So they may have a mix.
So in a country like South Africa, like you mentioned, where it is private insurance based, I assume that the end stage in the process is the regulatory approval. And once that's done, then it's completely up to insurers whether they're ready to pay or not. And then I question what would be the purpose of introducing HTA in that system.
I mean, the question is, why do we have healthcare systems anyway? Why don't we leave it up to the people to care for their health? Am I interested in the health of my neighbor? Not really. So, yeah, before Bismarck introduced the first health insurance, that's basically what we had and what many people in low and middle income countries still have.
Yeah.
You are responsible for your health. And if that doesn't work, maybe your family cares for you. And then that often means, because of high cost and everything, that they have to sell their house, they lose their jobs, they don't earn money anymore. There is financial crisis. And that's not good for the society. And the trick of healthcare systems is really we keep people in the system economically independent, basically, by caring for the sick people. Ideally, we even cure the sick people so they can go back to work and again contribute to the economic success of the society. So when we come from that perspective, it would be good to make healthcare decisions that are fair and equal for everybody in the society, that they have equal access to high quality healthcare, but only in a way that it's necessary and useful.
Yeah. So the World Health Organization has a goal of universal health coverage. And I assume then that in that framework is where health technology assessment would play a significant role in bringing universal health coverage to all countries.
That's definitely a goal, is to increase the use of health technology assessment to make decisions more transparent, more evidence-based, and more with the overall objective of equity and fairness.
Okay. Thank you. That was very enlightening.
So I was wondering then if you could talk us through what people look at during a health technology assessment. So it's been approved at a regulatory level to say that it's effective and it's safe. So what is it that the health technology assessments are looking at, and what factors influence whether a drug is successful or not in this process?
So, as I said, it's the intended and unintended consequences. The technology in terms of health outcomes and in terms of financial consequences. And what is the evidence that is used? So let's say the product has received market authorization, but it's not marketed yet. Then the only evidence we have is from the clinical trials. And maybe, depending on where we are, some real world evidence from other countries. And most often, the clinical trials, maybe they are comparative, but maybe the comparator that was used in the clinical trial isn't exactly what in real life is used in our country.
Right.
So how do we make a fair comparison between what we currently have and what the data we have on the new technology? To do so, often we use modeling techniques. That means we simulate the reality in a mathematical model, which helps us to compare against other therapies which may be used currently by introducing those into the model. And then we base these models on the numbers we have. But otherwise, we use the same evidence which comes from the clinical trials. We just may look with different eyes on the evidence. It's much more health benefits in comparison to current care. And health benefits could be in terms of length of life, quality of life, different specific aspects of quality of life. It could be other things, but usually it's something which is relevant to the patients. And then in combination with a price that is asked from the company, it's fairly easy to calculate. If 10 patients take the product, which costs $10,000 a year, then that is $100,000 for the healthcare system in terms of those costs. Then they have to drive to the hospital. So it's not the price of the product. It's the total cost of treatment, including the treatment of the side effect, for example. And then on the other side, we can say, what does it mean in terms of savings? Like, for example, maybe the patients are faster out of the hospital. That is hospital day is saved. That
Right.
is clear saving. So we can calculate all that. So we differentiate between direct costs and indirect costs. And then indirect medical costs or indirect non-medical costs. Non-medical costs would be something, if I go to the hospital, I have a little child, it needs childcare, and so on. That's not really a medical cost, but still I have to spend for this.
Right.
And it depends on the guidance of the Health Technology Assessment Agency on what they accept as a cost.
Right.
And these guidances are published. And then if the company wants to bring to the product, they have to produce either these models and submit them in the specific context.
So that's quite a big task.
Yeah.
And sometimes, just to make it even more complicated, it's also what are the outcomes we are interested in. For example, the UK puts a lot of emphasis on cost per QALY.
Yeah.
And QALY it's a strange measure. The full name is Quality Adjusted Life Year. Germany, they don't really like that measure.
Okay.
They like effect. So cost effectiveness is really only one part of the story, and it's used in some countries as a very important part of the story, which kind of guides the whole process of health technology assessment. But there are other countries, Germany, France, Japan, who put the first emphasis on additional benefit. If they come to the conclusion that the product doesn't deliver additional benefit, they don't even look at the cost.
Okay.
It's only in the next step that they will say, okay, how much do we have to pay for this benefit?
Interesting.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask then, my understanding is that while we thought that regulatory affairs requires so much of evidence, and it does seem like the HTA process actually requires even more evidence and more varied evidence sources and things like that. So what is the timeline then from, say, a drug getting marketing authorization to it actually even reaching the health technology assessment?
So we have health technology assessment since many years. The UK introduced this sometime in the end of the 90s, I think. So manufacturers, health technology developers, they know about this. They know it already when they develop their products. So they do it in parallel, basically. They generate evidence, which helps health technology assessment agencies to assess their part. So that is often not the big delay in the process. The delay may be because of structural reasons, political reasons, and so on. So there are a few countries who allow aftermarket authorization. The manufacturer can market the product and it has to be reimbursed unless a health technology assessment comes to the conclusion that it's not worth the money.
Oh,
Okay.
For example, Germany. So there is a high pressure on the health technology assessment unit to, as fast as possible, do the health technology assessment, because otherwise the system has to buy this product for a high price.
Yeah.
Then there are other countries who have these pressures in the healthcare system, in the financial system. They are not so keen on getting these expensive new products. Also, there is a risk in using new products. And the risk is they have only been tested in the clinical trials. So sometimes there is reason to say, let's be a bit slower with that. Let's the Germans take it first, and then we'll see how that works. So you see there are different mechanisms which play and different interests again on how this shapes out. So this can take half a year, or 3 years. It really depends on the environment, on the system, on how the structure is and how the process is and where HTA falls into it.
Interesting. Thank you. It does seem to be quite complicated and differs across the world, but I think it's been really helpful for you to explain how it varies and overall how it works. So what would a patient's role in a HTA be?
So it's a bit similar to the regulatory process. I mean, basically, what the expertise of the patients is the experience with their own disease, is the experience maybe with their peers. They know the community of patients, the difference between patients, and they know their interactions with the healthcare systems. And that is the knowledge they can bring into the process. Obviously, in the HTA, this is essential knowledge. Because here it's about how useful is this technology in our context, in my country. And here it's really where the patients, they can bring in a lot of information on this context, plus their own experiences, plus their own expectations, feasibility on using the product. If I have to go to the hospital to get infusions, that may work quite well if I live in the city and I can take the public transport. It may not work so well if I live somewhere in the countryside where I need to take a car for 3 hours to go someplace and I don't even have a driver or so. In principle, people know about this, but the patients know extremely well about this.
Yeah.
Now, how can they contribute? Again, it's different from country to country, but there are different levels. So sometimes patients can contribute actually in shaping the whole process. They can be in some committee or advisory board where they can help to advise the HTA agency in how to shape these processes overall, or with each specific HTA on what makes sense in terms of patient involvement and not. For example, in Wales, the Health Technology Assessment Agency, which is mostly focused on procedures and devices, they have this committee which for each technology goes through a checklist basically to say what type of patient involvement makes sense with this technology assessment. So that would be like on a bigger level, helping to make this useful and relevant. So the first thing for health technology assessment agencies is to know about these new technologies coming up so they can plan. What they do is something called horizon scanning. So they look up what is coming and how patients can participate in that. Theoretically, they could. That is not extremely established, and not all agencies do this horizon scanning. Then once the technology comes to the assessment, then the HTA agency has to think about what is actually the questions we want to ask about this technology. What is important to know? And that is called the scoping. So they kind of produce a framework on how they assess this technology. And in this framework, they will ask about like, what is the population for which this technology will be used? What is the intervention? So that's more the technical description of the new technology. What is the comparator? What is the actual treatment they are getting and to which we would have to compare? And then what is the outcomes we are interested in? And all of these aspects patients could actually contribute to. That's the scoping. Then at some point there would be a call to patients to give input. Patients need to be aware about this opportunity, and that's why patient organizations can help to spread that knowledge, because not every patient goes to the website.
Yeah.
Then there is evidence collection. Patient organizations could collect evidence, for example, do surveys with their members to respond to specific questions the agencies would have. Sometimes they ask for patients to interview. Sometimes they ask for patients to participate in focus groups. Then there is, once they've collected all the evidence, the assessment of the evidence, and they produce a report. The report is published on the website, and then patients often are asked for consultation to read through the report and give their input. So that's the consultation. And then patients can be in the appraisal committee in some countries where they actually sit and discuss this evidence. What does it mean? And how do we want to interpret it in our country? And in some countries, they can vote in the end of this appraisal. In other countries, they cannot. So then there is a final report coming out of the HTA, which has some recommendations. And this goes to the decision-making institution, committee, or whatever it is, who will then, based on the recommendations from this report, they will make a decision. Usually the decision is separate from the health technology assessment.
Yeah.
So I think that one point that you made when you were talking about regulatory affairs also applies here. which is that, if a patient is involved in a regulatory affairs or a health technology assessment committee and then gets upset that the product is not getting approved or the decision is not working in their favor, do you think that there's an inherent conflict of interest that they bring in terms of how they're able to be objective in that situation, I guess, because they really want this product to improve their quality of life? So I'd love to hear from both of you about that.
I think if you want to make a valuable contribution to health technology assessment, somehow you have to change your attitude from being an advocate to being a partner in this. Because in the end, what we should want is the best decision for the patients in our countries or the population in our country based on all the best evidence we have. And you said we really wish that the medicine improves our life. Yes, I absolutely agree. But that doesn't make the medicine a good medicine. Our wishes and hopes. It doesn't mean that the medicine is valuable in our context. And that we need to understand. The assessment is done to make a rational decision about, does it give added value in our context, and is it worth the price to pay for it? Because if we pay too much for it, there will be other patients with other diseases who don't get access to their medication or whatever, because there's no money left for them. What helps probably is really to also educate people who want to be involved that their involvement means that they need to contribute to making a fair and legitimate decision. And that sometimes doesn't mean that the technology is approved, but they had the opportunity to give the best input they could give.
I totally agree with everything you said, Anke, but I think sometimes, especially if you're in a rare disease where there isn't currently a treatment, the benefit can be huge, but the price is also huge. And I think what's really difficult actually from a patient perspective is, how do you put a price on someone's life? And I think thinking of it in the wider perspective, like you said, is helpful to say, is it worth millions of pounds to help a few people versus taking that away from maybe thousands of people that you could help with the same amount of money? So thinking of it in that wider context is helpful. But when you're honing in on a specific technology that could help you or your family member specifically, I think that's really difficult not to be biased. But all you can do in that sense, again, you're not making the decision. So you're not really being biased. You're just providing your true experience and feelings. And I suppose hope that that is enough evidence to prove it is worth the price. And I was in quite an interesting situation, actually. So my experience with this is that a drug had been approved and I'd actually had access to it for 3 years. And the HTA agency in the UK, which is called NICE, had given a 3-year deal so that everyone had access to that drug for 3 years, and then they were going to reassess. So the situation I had was that they reassessed it and actually said, oh, based on the evidence of the last 3 years, we don't think that the price that the company has given us is effective. So that was a really interesting position because I'd actually firsthand not only experienced what it's like without the drug, but then I'd had 3 years of experience with the drug. So it was cystic fibrosis, and the CF Trust in the UK had a submission. And then also they'd called for people to submit their own experiences. But what was really interesting was just having a read of what the NICE sort of review said. It was only a draft guidance, but they said it wasn't cost effective. And when I read through and looked at their models, I realised they didn't necessarily maybe understand the wider context. So they have the numbers and they have those economic models we were talking about, direct and indirect costs. But what does that actually mean in terms of quality of life and contributions to society? And I think a lot of people wrote in to say, these numbers are one thing, but have you considered the fact that I've got a full-time job and I'm doing a podcast, contributing to society and paying rent? But had I not had that drug, there's a good chance that I would be sitting in a hospital right now, taking up a hospital bed, waiting for a lung transplant. And then after that, my quality of life might have improved again, but that costs an awful lot of money to get that transplant, and the drugs that are involved and the tests that are involved. And from a day to day, the fact that I don't cough anymore, I can go outside, I can spend time with my friends without coughing and spluttering without being shouted at on the street because they think that I have COVID. All sorts of these small angles that aren't captured in just the data. And I mean, I'd like to hope that that's something as well that really provides some colour and real life experience and light to what those numbers actually mean and what those numbers don't capture. And I don't know if it was the patient voices that contributed or whether it was further evidence that was submitted, but NICE did change their mind in that situation. So,
hey, that's excellent.
So I think that's the kind of things which really make a difference.
So, Anka, this has been excellent. We've really learned so much, and it's been just so rich and so insightful. I feel a little more confident about being able to explain these processes to other people if I have to, and I have you to thank for that. So, just before we wrap up, we would love to know if you have advice for patients who would like to get more involved in some of these processes.
Yeah, I guess the biggest advice is understand your system, understand what are the opportunities to be involved. I mean, test the waters, perhaps try a bit carefully first. But if you want to become more involved, then do one of these trainings. You both have the experience with the U-Party training. There are patient organizations who offer these kind of trainings. Sometimes there are universities who offer these trainings specifically for HTA. There's a new program developed by U-Party for European patients to be involved in the European HTA process. And there is another European training from the program called EUCAPA, EUCAPA, which is also for patients. Super good content of these trainings and so on.
Thank you. And I certainly agree that although it seems daunting, even just in this conversation, it's made me feel a lot more confident in what those processes are.
One more thing to keep in mind when you start this endeavor is this is daunting for you, but it's also daunting for the people on the other side of the table. The researchers, they need to learn how to interact with patients. Often they are good researchers, and this is what they've learned to deal with evidence, but to deal with stories or qualitative evidence is a bit more difficult for them. And so I think we all need to be aware that this is a learning process where both sides learn in the communication with each other what it means to involve patients or to be involved.
Right. Great. Yeah, and similarly, just to close this off, what would be your advice then for some of the other stakeholders, the regulatory officials and the HTA bodies who want to involve patients more?
Well, we have recently concluded our European project on stakeholder experiences with patient involvement in European HTA processes. And we've published a report on that, which is kind of recommendations along the HTA process on how to do things in a way that they are perceived well by the stakeholders who participate in it. And we worked with patients, we worked with HTA people and industry people on this. And there are a few things which come to my mind. One aspect I really, really like is the organizational involvement. Start to involve patients when you build the processes to get input on the high level part. And obviously training and information is like give information that is relevant for patients. That could, for example, include summaries in patient language, which you could ask the industry to submit together with the rest of the dossier. Patients don't have to become experts in health economics and whatnot. That's not the reason they are involved. But they should understand why the questions are asked, how they can best respond. What is the part the HTA agency is interested in, and how can patients bring this part? And patients should get feedback on what happened with your input. How did we consider it in the report? How did we consider it in the appraisal, maybe, or in the decision? And if you don't give this feedback, patients do this once, maybe twice, and then they say, like, I have no clue what these guys are doing with my input. I spend my time with better things.
That's great. Thank you so much for just everything you've said today and for your time. I think it's really helped to unravel what is a really complicated and I think a topic that people aren't very aware of. So I'm sure this will be extremely helpful to a lot of people who have heard of regulatory affairs and HTA but don't really understand what that means. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to join you. I hope I don't confuse people more than they were before.
No,
not at all. It was very well simplified.
Thank you so much.
So, Caitlin, I think that was a really informative discussion. I learned so much. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about some of the top things that you learned.
Absolutely. So I think I learned a lot about how these processes work. They're obviously quite complex, but I now understand the objective behind them a lot more. And I think what really stood out for me is the value that patients can bring to these processes. From a regulatory affairs process, obviously, the idea is to assess benefits versus risk. And I think it's difficult to do that without the patient perspective because the benefits and the risk will probably be different from a patient perspective than from an outside perspective. Likewise, with the HTA, patients can provide the colour to all of the data and all the cost models that they use and really show a more holistic view of how that impacts the patient, of the healthcare system and society.
Right. And one thing that I learned that I was not aware of was that perhaps if patients are closely collaborating with pharma in the drug development process itself, then they might not be able to get involved in regulatory affairs and HTA because that might be a conflict of interest. But it is fine, really, because it means that patients are contributing somewhere in the timeline. It's fine to contribute wherever seems best suited to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really encouraging as well is that I know many people may feel a bit worried or scared or have imposter syndrome about being involved in regulatory affairs or HTA because the processes aren't as well known. But what's comforting to hear is that firstly, they are really encouraging patient engagement and even in some cases specifically looking for people who just live with the disease and don't necessarily know a lot about the processes. But also, the main expertise they're looking for is that lived experience. So by definition, any patient can get involved. So you shouldn't feel like you can't contribute meaningfully.
I agree. And I hope that more patients do take the opportunity to get involved in some of these processes.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been Not Just Patients with our guest, Dr. Anke-Peggy Holtorf, and your hosts, Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Sarasia.